This is Duke University.
So good morning, everybody. I'm Amy Pickle. I'm the Director of State Policy at the Nicholas Institute, where, as many of you know, we have been very interested in both the science of ecosystem services and the policy implementation. And one of the questions that's been particularly interesting to me is the intersection of information and decision frameworks for the private sector. So I'm very delighted to be able to introduce Shelia Walsh, who is a senior scientist with the Nature Conservancy, who has been working on a pilot project with Dow Chemical related to just that, of looking at information and how the information related to ecosystem services might impact Dow's overall business decisions. So with that, I will turn it over to Sheila. And if folks who are on electronically have any problems with audio, wave. Okay, so good. I think we're good on that point, and we'll figure out if anything explodes between now and then. So with that, Sheila.
Hopefully no explosions.
No explosions.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to give you a little bit of a picture of what the problem is here, what we're trying to do to solve it through some analyses that we're doing at various pilot sites. And then we'll just really open it up for discussion, because I think this is a really exciting and emerging field where ecosystem service science is getting into the hands of decision makers, and there's a lot to be learned. So incorporating the value of nature into business decisions. Why is this important? So businesses are really good at accounting for manufactured capital, financial capital, and increasingly they're even pretty good at accounting for human capital, or at least managing towards that. They're recognizing that as a key part of their business strategies. But businesses really don't have a good handle on how to account for the things that they get from nature. Assets like a river that provides clean water, or, for instance, there are liabilities associated with those assets, so pollution, for instance. And really, businesses are recognizing that the fact that they can't really account for these things or recognize them are a growing risk in light of increasing environmental degradation. So last year, KPMG really highlighted this for businesses. They said that the 10 mega risks for businesses included ecosystem decline. And arguably, most of the other things on this list also connect to some form of ecosystem degradation or change. So water scarcity, we've got deforestation there, food security. You guys are the Nicholas School. You know that these sort of things are interrelated. But it's not all doom and gloom. Businesses are also starting to see this as a real opportunity for them. Businesses tend to be innovators, and they're hearing things like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the TEEB report, saying that sustainably managed ecosystems might actually be more valuable than degraded ones. But they're still not quite sure what to do with this. At the same time, the conservation community is going through a transformation. So I'm with the Nature Conservancy. We got our start about 60 years ago, a bunch of ecologically minded folks deciding to protect important places, and well, what would they do but just go out and buy it? These are the folks who made our first purchase of 60 acres in the Mianus River Gorge. This bucks and acres model was a pretty good thing, and it's still a lot of what we do. And now in 2013, we have protected lands that, when you squish them all together, are about the size of California. And we're the second largest landowner in the United States. So this has certainly worked. But I think there's still a lot of white space on that map, right? So we've come to the realization that although, straight out, protecting land is an important part of what we do, we are not going to succeed unless we make conservation a regular part of doing business, or just living the lives that we lead. So as part of this recognition, we've been going through this paradigm shift, along with a lot of the other conservation organizations away from protecting nature from people to protecting nature for people. So the whole ecosystem services concept is starting to be really central to what we do. So these shared goals are what brought the Nature Conservancy and Dow together. A lot of people have said, okay, these are strange bedfellows. There's people at Dow who asked me if we were sort of like Greenpeace. And when I first got hired to lead science on this collaboration, I got thrown in the midst of a debate at the Nature Conservancy where our science communications people put up the dichotomy of biodiversity versus ecosystem services. So these sort of collaborations are coming with a lot of trepidation from both organizations. But it's actually not as strange of a collaboration as you might think. As I showed you, we have shared goals of trying to understand when investing in conservation makes sense for people and nature. And we're a little bit more similar than you might think. We're learning this more and more as we work together. We're in the end of our second year, well, actually the beginning of our third. We're both pragmatic. We're both science-based. We're both global. And we're going to use that science to try and figure out how we can develop methods to understand when investing in conservation makes business sense. So at the heart of this collaboration is really a hypothesis. It's a science-based collaboration for about 5 years. We are working on figuring out whether if we incorporate the value of nature into business decisions, we will in fact get improved conservation outcomes and improved business outcomes. And through working on this in particular places and particular questions, we think that this could ultimately inform policy, both public policy and within businesses, to make this a regular part of what they do. Okay, so let me step aside for a second and say, value of nature, what is that? This is a pretty big general term. But in this collaboration, we are defining our accounting stance for the value of nature as being the economic benefits to the company, the economic benefits to the public, and non-economic benefits to ecosystems. So this is important to remember as we're going through some of the results that I'm going to share with you. Okay, so we've got a collaboration. We've got 5 years plus that we're committed to working together. We've got a clearly defined hypothesis, but this is a pretty tall order. And let me just say that the CEO of Dow took it even a step further. In the first year when we were announcing the collaboration, Andrew Livers was at the Detroit Economic Club. He took it a step further. He went off script and he said, we are going to incorporate the value of nature into all of our business decisions. Okay, we said, all right, well, we have 5 years and the foundation gave us $10 million and we need to produce benefits, products that benefit the general public and all business decisions. Okay, well, clearly this is the long-run vision, but I think it's an important one. And how are we going to start with that? That's a big problem. We're going to break it down into specific decisions that eventually, by the end, give us a framework that can kind of guide businesses into how they can build this out through their work. So that's the pilot site approach. Our first pilot site, which I'll spend most of my time talking about, is in Freeport, Texas. This is Dow's largest facility. It's a traditional, well, actually not traditional, advanced integrated chemical facility. I'll tell you a few more details about it in a moment. The second pilot site is totally different. There's not even any seeming industrial facility there yet. It's in Brazil. It's where they have pioneered new technologies to convert sugarcane to plastics, and this is a out-the-gate carbon negative technology. And the third pilot site, likely to be in Asia, is still to be determined. So I'll focus on the results of the first pilot, preview the science of the second one, and then also give you sort of a picture for how does this specific work with Dow expand out to changing how businesses do work in general and how conservation does our work. Okay, so Texas operations of Freeport, Texas. So at Dow, they have a little saying that most advanced technology, MAT, means made at Texas. This is Dow's largest facility. It leads the company in sales in the US and globally, and again, in technology. So it really was the place to go first. It lies along the Gulf of Mexico, just south of Houston. It's surrounded by large coastal marshes. It's on the Brazos River. But really the dominating thing when you get there is that this integrated facility, which is the second largest in the world, but Dow's largest, is the size of Manhattan. I mean, this thing is huge. I got there and I was like, okay, I know I want to change the world, and this is a long ways from this whole work on coral reefs and poverty stuff in the South Pacific that I used to do, but this might be a good place to start. So it's a little bit of an unusual pilot site for a normal Nature Conservancy sort of science group, but it's the sort of place to get going on the types of questions that we're after. So what were those questions? We brought together a group of Nature Conservancy experts, so from our global programs, from our Texas chapter. So we have a structure where we have global programs and then offices in all 50 states and 33 countries. So we brought our Texas folks, global folks. We had the Dow folks there. And we went through some formalized processes to identify key business decisions and ecosystem services, how they intersected, and where we had the biggest opportunity to advance science and business outcomes. But before we got down to that really strict stuff, there was a lot of getting to know each other, and people were kidding around that this was sort of like coming to a wedding, a somewhat awkward wedding, where we didn't really know each other. We were looking across the aisle wondering what the other side of the family was kind of all about. We were the ones in fleece, well, some of us, and they were the engineers and chemists. So what we ended up focusing on is asking the question of what role do coastal habitats play in storm mitigation, and how does this compare to building levees or traditional gray infrastructure? This is actually building levees as a key question that they were actually focusing at the time, but they weren't thinking about habitats. Then there was the sneaker pick, the planting trees for air quality mitigation. So at first we were like, wait, this doesn't sound cutting edge, but you'll see in a minute that this question really focused on the issue of whether it could be cost-effective to do large-scale reforestation to meet urban air pollution requirements. And then fresh water. So how does Dow better do risk assessment and identify new solutions for fresh water, which is a really big deal in lots of places of the world, and especially in South Texas. Okay, so I'm going to start with this issue of coastal protection. So this is a map of the facility here. This is on the Gulf of Mexico. I think I have a pointer here. And what you're looking at is the green is all natural coastal habitat. This is a really interesting place from a conservation standpoint because it actually has the highest bird biodiversity count on a regular basis every year because it's a key stopover spot for migratory birds. Now, right here is the Dow facility. I made the classic or really awful mistake of not putting up a scale, but like I said, this is Manhattan. But okay, that's just the footprint of the facility. In gray is what's protected within a levee. In red is what is not. And like I was mentioning earlier, this is an integrated facility. So, and this is in a low-lying zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So they are really vulnerable 2 storms having parts of the integrated facility outside of the levee. And they were starting to look at the Stratton Ridge. This is a bit of a misnomer. It's only 12 feet in elevation. They were looking at how they could protect Stratton Ridge by building levees. And we said, well, hey, you also happen to have these other forms of protection in front of Stratton Ridge. Let's put the 2 side by side, and let's see how they compare. So that was basically our question. How do you put salt marshes on the books next to levees and account for avoided property damage and business interruption, so the benefits to the business, but also then the benefits to the public and to ecosystems from these alternatives or even a hybrid solution? So Dow had done a lot of modeling of this already with AIR, one of the lead catastrophe modeling corporations. We worked some with them, but we primarily did this analysis using the Invest Coastal Protection Model, a tool developed by our collaborators and at the Natural Capital Project. TNC is a founder of that project. We use the Invest Coastal Protection Model to estimate these benefits, as well as a suite of other analyses to look at co-benefits or benefits to the public and biodiversity. So I'm going to jump straight to the results and show you that what we found is that the protection from these marshes for the business was quite small. So this is the blue bar, compared to what you would get from a levee. However, the public benefits were quite large. So what we're seeing here is that habitat alone is providing certain benefits, but a levee is definitely critical in this case, but that the hybrid solution still wins out when you're counting all of the benefits. And this really actually made a lot of sense, because this site is really at the low end of what is potentially protective for big hurricanes and storm surge. So regular wave attenuation, things like that, no problem. But we were modeling the effects of major hurricanes. So we're seeing that together, levees and habitats still provide the most protection, but habitats alone, in terms of private storm protection, those benefits are fairly small.
Sheila, can you just say what you mean by the hybrid solution? Because looking at this, it looks
Yep.
like what you're doing is just adding the habitat values to the levee values. Now, I think a hybrid solution would be one where you back off a little bit on the levees, so maybe they're not quite as extensive, and you add the habitat to that. But that's not what this looks like.
Well, thanks for asking that, because actually it is what I didn't go into detail on is what we do in the case where you have the hybrid solution is you say, okay, what would the flood heights be with the habitats there? And then you actually change the levee design based on the savings or protection from the habitat. It's just that in this case, those marshes, although on the map initially looked like, oh, wow, that's an opportunity, they're only about 4 kilometers of pretty patchy marsh, which is really at the low end of like what's going to do protection for a big hurricane, which is what really causes the damages. They do great in terms of day-to-day wave attenuation, things like that. Big storm surge, they have their limits. So the hybrid solution actually does, what we do is first the levee protection has to be based on a 100-year storm. So first we simulate the 100-year storm. We figure out the flood heights associated with that when you have the habitat or the baseline of dry land, which was the previous modeling assumption used by AIR and Dow. And then we say, okay, well, with habitat, actually, that design height for that levee is a little bit lower. Now, let's say, what do we get from those two combined? So the private protection is from levee cost savings, avoided property damage, and avoided business interruption. So it is truly a hybrid solution. It's just doesn't look too different because it's fairly small. But then also, because our accounting framework is about private benefits, public benefits, and benefits to ecosystems, we also accounted for some non-economic, well, fisheries is economic, but other benefits in terms of species. These habitats support about 12 fishery species and about 300 bird species. And in terms of modeling changes in the productivity of these, we also used some of the INVEST models and looked at scenarios with sea level rise. And that actually was a real insight for Dow's management. It was the effect not just of habitat, but the changes in habitat that would happen with sea level rise, because we would see, I'm not going to share all the results, but that they're going to lose about 5,000 acres of habitat, which could end up increasing the potential damages from storms far more than the differences in habitat alone, current habitat alone. So in Freeport, there's not a big protective role of those habitats because they're quite small. This is, again, not surprising in the end, although the public benefits were totally unrealized before and were quite large. But this laid the groundwork for how the business would go ahead and look at these opportunities in other sites. So our co-lead at Dow is in charge of managing risk for all of Dow's facilities across the Gulf of Mexico. So this is a very significant job. And if you look across the Gulf of Mexico, this is our study site. You can barely see the habitats here. Now, as you move towards areas like New Orleans, you're getting into about 50-kilometer stretches of habitats. And empirical studies show that actually the low end of protective values are around 4 to 5 kilometers. And then you start getting pretty more certain reductions in surge of, say, a meter or so, which start really making an economic difference when you start having things like 50 kilometers. So although on one hand, these results were small here, it's really important to highlight not only when it makes sense to invest in conservation, but when it doesn't make as much sense for private benefits. Okay, so that was coastal protection, but now what about air quality through large-scale reforestation? So what's the issue here? So in our last case, we were talking about risk management and building a levee. Now Dow has a specific decision of what to do with an expansion at the facility and how to meet urban air pollution requirements. So you guys probably all know about ozone. It's harmful to human health, to ecosystems. And in the US, there's 43 what are called non-attainment zones for ground level ozone, which covers about a population of 130 million people. So this is a really significant thing in the United States. And businesses, if they want to do an expansion, need to have credits to show that they're offsetting any increase in their pollution. And typically, these folks will turn to engineered solutions, to the things that they're familiar with. But interestingly, we know a lot about the science of how trees remove pollution from the air. I mean, this is not new. Everybody in environmental science learns about this. But most importantly, it's also been demonstrated through applications of the urban forestry model that was developed by the US Forest Service. And EPA even has it on the books that this is something that could be done to meet with these regulations. It's just no one's ever actually run the numbers to see if this might make sense, and most importantly, to see if it's cost effective relative to the traditional solutions. So that's what we set out to do. So typically, a business is going to the engineers are going to turn to what they know. They're going to say, okay, we're expanding by this much. We're going to have this much NOx and VOx. I'm going to invest in this many scrubbers. And we're saying, well, what about planting a forest? And in the Freeport area, this is also an exciting opportunity from a conservation perspective because they're in an area called the Columbia Bottomland Hardwood Forest area, which is only a remnant of the past. It's about 30% of what it used to be. So there could be an opportunity both to mitigate air pollution, but also to reforest a very important area from a biodiversity standpoint. So, teaming up with folks from the University of Florida and U.S. Forest Service, we ran the models for a hypothetical forest just between Houston and Dow, which was chosen based on where we could plant particular native trees hypothetically, and also based on air circulation in the area and the potential for removal. And again, I'm jumping straight to the bottom line, and I can talk more about methods with any of these later on. But what we're seeing here is we've got a couple different options that we explored. So we have reforestation with carbon credits, reforestation without carbon credits, when you just pay for NOx allowances, or the conventional control. So this is our scrubber. And what we're showing here is that reforestation can be cost effective, and especially with carbon credits, it looks particularly attractive. So this was sort of an exciting finding. We weren't sure how this would turn out, and now we're in the process of working with the with TCEQ, or the Texas Center for Environmental Quality, to get the methods that we developed approved and get this to be an option for Texas. And this has real implications because, as I said, EPA had it on the books that this was possible. And if we can get it approved in Texas, then elsewhere this could be a strategy to work to promote investment in reforestation throughout the United States. Okay, so last I'm going to talk to you a little bit about fresh water in Texas. So with this, we're at a stage with the results where we're still doing some internal review regarding confidential data, so I'm going to have to talk to you a lot about the results rather than show some of them like I was able to just earlier. But fresh water is a really critical issue for Dow in Texas and many businesses, of course. But what's interesting is that in this case, Dow has a water right, and they essentially treat it like a utility. They pay pumping costs, maintenance, but they don't necessarily think about it as an asset, and they don't have ways to plan strategically for it or take a bigger basin-level perspective on how the behavior of other people in the basin will affect them, other than through just physical changes. They hadn't really been thinking about the economic behavior and what might be happening with climate change and changes in demand. So what we did was bring a new perspective on risk assessment and ways to identify new solutions to this problem that they've been spending a lot of effort on. The 2011 drought in Texas was a really critical event where areas of the Brazos River, shown here, actually ran dry. Okay, so water risk. There are lots of papers nowadays talking about water scarcity. So typically, we're talking about, okay, how much is being used out of how much is available. We're looking at just these physical shortfalls. But it turns out that you can have similar levels of physical scarcity and very different levels of economic risk or exposure due to how much of that water is in high-value uses. So municipal uses, industrial, or even in some places now, recreational values, many values are more valuable than industrial uses, for instance. So that's the case of the Brazos River in where Dow is located. So what I'm showing here is the Rio Grande, which is sort of a typical southwestern river where you've got the majority of your water use coming from low value, sort of inefficient uses in agriculture. So you're talking like 70% of water use. The Brazos is the flip. We've got like 70% municipal and industrial. So it's in a really different position from a risk perspective, and it also indicates that there might be something really different in terms of what opportunities there are for solutions, say through trading. So we've been using this concept to think a little bit about, okay, what about those rivers that not only have physical water scarcity, but there's a low amount of water that's available from cheaper, inefficient uses. So there's already been a lot squeezed out of the river due to historical reallocation. So what did we do? So we took a basin level view at this risk, knowing that this river is a really different sort of river, but one that might actually resemble a lot of rivers in the future. So growth in demand and climate, we're going to change both physical and cheap water scarcity going forward. We used coupled hydro and economic modeling to look at how different do the patterns of future impacts of water availability look like if you look at physical shortfalls versus economic losses. So there's consensus that water should be managed based on our economic understanding of the value of water. However, it hasn't really been implemented well at, say, the regional planning level or at the business. So this was sort of a key highlight to say, you're managing based on physical impacts, but the patterns that you're going to see from demand growth and climate change are going to be really different when you look at the economic losses. So we did that, and then we also said, well, you're under a governance system of priority allocation, which is very typical. So first, it has to do with historic dates of priority for pumping. But now what if, even though there is very little cheap water available in this basin, how much could a market trading scheme actually offset future losses from climate change? And we found that that it far offset it, even with having very little available in terms of cheaper water sources. And this simulation of the trading also allowed us to project a price of water that would emerge if the market became more active. And this was really a key thing for Dow because they're used to planning strategically using forecasted prices for oil and other resources that they typically rely on. And they know those numbers aren't totally right, but they're a compass. And so through simulating the market in the basin, although they might not necessarily be facing that price because there isn't a mature market yet, this is something that can help them with strategic planning. So that's what we did at the basin level. And that also allowed us to then focus in on the business using those forecasted prices and expected economic and physical impacts and say, okay, well, what is your water right worth? And how is that going to change with future scenarios of climate change and demand? So we valued the freshwater asset, which they'd never done before. And again, it's a lot more of a guide. It's showing like what avoided costs they have and how is that going to change as prices potentially rise in the basin or as water becomes less available. And what was a really important learning from that exercise was not, of course, the absolute number, although that was very key and to, again, reinforcing to the leadership that this is a key asset for them, but that really, really, really small changes in the reliability of their water right lead to really large losses. And so this motivated them at looking at some new alternative green or collaborative solutions that would have otherwise maybe been a little farther down their list of ways to tackle the reliability of their water right. So we again brought together a bunch of experts who had, during the height of their 2011 drought, gone through every possible solution they could do to think about enhancing supply, decreasing demand, enhancing storage. And we said, okay, let's get outside of the box and we're going to try and have you guys, okay, think like engineers, but think at a basin scale. Think about 60 years. Think about collaboration. And we came up with really a huge set of potential solutions. We used the same sort of prioritization scheme that they did for their traditional solutions to come up with a set of 5 that we investigated further. The first is floodplain restoration and reservoir reallocation. Maybe some of you are familiar with this. This is something TNC has worked on in other places. But the idea is that reservoirs have this flood pool, so this extra space that you have to keep in case there's a flood. But that might not be needed as much if you actually have healthy, intact floodplains. So restore the floodplain, open up some of the space in the reservoir, and now you have more storage. And by the way, you have additional ecosystem benefits and habitat for wildlife. Then there's land cover management. So there's a huge number of acres covered in high water use invasive species in the Panhandle section of the Brazos. I didn't mention, but the Brazos spans all of Texas, so it's quite diverse. There's coastal marsh water treatment, so using habitats for tertiary treatment so that they could get wastewater from Houston. Municipal rebates, proven sort of activity, but the idea then is actually have it be more like a water fund where a private organization is funding something like a municipal rebate, and similarly incentives for irrigation technology to be more efficient. So we did a cost-benefit analysis of all of these using the accounting stance I talked about before, benefits to the company, benefits to public, and biodiversity benefits. And we found that 4 out of 5 of these are cost competitive, and so there's interest in investigating them going forward. However, they all come with more risks and uncertainty than traditional solutions, so that's also another hurdle that's important in the evaluation. So in sum, with the first pilot site, our key outcome was really demonstrating how you link ecological change to changes in economic values in the context of specific business decisions. So that was really the focus. And because some of these identified some pretty attractive novel solutions, we're having a lot of activity on the ground going forward with our TNC Texas chapter as well as Dow in terms of getting, say, the air quality through large-scale reforestation activities to really get that to be something that is possible for the business to do and that we could leverage to all other places across the U.S. Coastal protection, we identified that this was not a place for really great private benefits, although there are large public benefits. And the two sort of follow-on things that are happening there are one that I just recently presented this work to the Reinsurance Association of America's Catastrophe Modeling conference. This sounds kind of maybe like an odd place to be, but they're the leaders in assessing risk due to storms, and these folks are excited and interested in figuring out how do they get habitats into the core models that set prices for insurance and produce information for businesses. So ours was a demonstration, and this is saying, hey, this is a valuable and important way to go. And some places it'll work, some places it won't. But we still need to be able to understand when and where. And then freshwater. So this has always been a thorny issue in Texas and otherwise, but this is really, in Dow parlance, opened the solution space for them and gotten them thinking about new solutions as well as thinking about water as an asset rather than a utility, and is actually changing some of the ways in which they do emergency planning for water now. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of preview of what's going on with our second pilot site. It's just underway. We've been scoping out the questions for it. We took a lovely trip down to Brazil right in advance of Carnival. I don't know if that's what made the first kickoff meeting so much easier or whether it was because we had gone through the growing pains of getting to know one another in Texas. But we went down to Brazil, and we got to see, like I said, not a big integrated chemical facility like the one in Freeport, but a bunch of sugarcane fields. I was like, well, is this Dow? Okay, here we are. We're in the middle of the Atlantic forest and the Cerrado. So this is prime agricultural area for Brazil. And again, we had our Brazil team saying, why are we going there? Where's the biodiversity? But actually, that was only some folks. Our Brazil team has been doing a lot of work with the Brazilian Forest Code, which is a really important policy context for this site and this pilot. So the Brazilian Forest Code, although there's very low compliance, requires a set amount of land to be kept as forest or reforested when there's any development. And our Brazil team has been working to develop spatial tools to figure out how this can be done in a way that's more efficient. So it tends to be that people meet the Brazilian Forest Code by just having this tiny patch within their property. But that's really not going to do as much for biodiversity as if you could coordinate people on a larger regional scale and get bigger chunks of forest altogether. So that's something we had already been doing in Brazil. But now with DAO, we're saying, well, OK, we've just been thinking about the biodiversity parts. Let's think about how we can comply with the Brazilian Forest Code in a way that, I think this is the next slide, maximizes benefits to sugarcane production. So we hadn't been thinking about the business part of it at all. And not just the biodiversity benefits, but the ecosystem service benefits from forest reforestation. So how can we move this from compliance to something that actually benefits the business? Because they recognize that soil loss due to erosion is critical to the production of their product, and that eventually, and just a reminder, because I talked about this earlier, but the sugarcane is the input to bioplastics. So this is really something that when we went to visit them in Brazil, there was not this big process. It was like we saw eye to eye. They had agronomists on the ground who were already kind of worrying about, of course, well, they're agronomists. They worry about this, what soil types to be at, what the water availability is, and they were purchasing old cattle ranches. So this is not converting forest to sugarcane. It's converting cattle ranches to sugarcane. They're already trying to identify this across the landscape, and we were saying, well, hey, let's bring in this other piece. You have to comply with the forest code. Why don't you get something more out of it? Let's get what you're already looking for, which is higher soil quality and water quality. So this work is underway, and we will have more to say soon, I'm sure. But we also are happy to say that one of your own will be joining us as a postdoc on this project. And we're really looking forward to bringing in lots of interdisciplinary expertise. And I think this is going to be a whole nother tack than Freeport. What's really important with this is that we are integrating the ecosystem services more as opposed to looking at them separately. So that's a distinction from the approach with Freeport on the ecosystem service side. And then on the business side, a distinction is that now we're starting to look up through the supply chain. So we're looking at that sugarcane that's coming into the production of plastics and how ecosystem services play a role in the supply chain. Okay, so all these pilot sites are going to be, over the course of the 5+ year collaboration, building towards a framework. We overuse the term framework, but building us more of a vision of how businesses can think about ecosystem services in more of a cross-cutting way. Where are the priority decisions that interface with ecosystem services? And then how do you also account for these and manage towards them at the corporate level? So businesses like Dow take sustainability goals very, very seriously. So this collaboration is in part towards setting up their next round of sustainability goals. So we have one cross-cutting project that's already been underway, which has been this Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Trends and Conditions Assessment Tool. Too many words there probably, but it's already been something that, well, actually when the project first got started, we did a little bit of an overlap of Dow's footprint and biodiversity alone, and these big red dots ended up in places like Brazil and Texas. So that's part of why we went there. And then we are taking this the next step, and this has already helped Dow as they're thinking about new sites and with their required reporting. So again, compliance is important, but we're looking to move them to the next step where they actively want to invest in conservation, not because of compliance, but because it makes business sense. So basically, stay tuned. We will have a lot more to say about how this rolls up into corporate goals and strategy later. But for now, what are the main outcomes? So we've demonstrated new methods for integrating ecosystem services into specific business decisions. So things like coastal protection, air pollution. You might say, okay, well, we knew the science about that. You know, actually, there are a lot more gaps there in the science than you might think. You know, making those links from the ecology to the economics, and then putting it in a context of a real decision, I would argue that is pretty new stuff. And that's what really is needed to get these things to have traction and to be a regular part of doing business. So because all of our work, we're a nonprofit, this project is funded by the Dow Chemical Company Foundation. This is going to be shared publicly through peer-reviewed publications. I'm sharing it now. And the idea is really to give people examples in a way forward and get other businesses to take this up, as well as identify new conservation strategies like large-scale reforestation. Who knew tree planting could go high-tech? And you know, that's the short term. This collaboration is really about methods. You know, I love doing the science, and it's fun to be in this position leading the science. But then after that, I pretty much hand it off to TNC Texas, TNC Brazil, you know, the Dow folks there. They're the ones on the ground who are going to figure out, do we plant that forest near to Houston, or do we go look at that marsh near New Orleans and things like that. So you might say, okay, well, it's just methods, it's just science. But the thing that gives me the vision of this having a big impact in the future is the sort of corporate culture change that is happening at Dow, and even some of the change that's happening at TNC. So really getting these new perspectives, getting this ecosystem perspective on their decision making. So I want to leave you with one anecdote that gives me an idea of where we might see companies in 10, 20 years. We don't know quite how long it'll take. But Dow, probably a few things come to mind that aren't so great when you hear a name like a big chemical company. But the chemical industry, and Dow in particular, over the last number of decades, went through a major, major change in human health and safety. This is now totally a part of their blood. This is what they do. That is probably one of the safest places to be, believe it or not. And what they're telling us one time is if you go to their headquarters in Midland, Michigan, which we've now done, you can drive around Midland. It's a company town. Nice houses, lawns. And in the summertime, you can figure out who is a Dow employee. So you're driving along and you see people mowing their lawn. Guess who the Dow employee is? They're at home wearing closed-toed steel shoes, glasses, eye goggles, all the protective gear while mowing their lawn. This is not just compliance. This is like a culture that they live and breathe, which is about human health and safety. And that didn't happen overnight. But that's the vision that they gave me for the change that happened for them with human health and safety. And I think it'll be the same for ecosystem services. And this is just the beginning. So it's just the beginning, but like any big project, there are lots of people involved. So I want to acknowledge all of our core teams at TNC and Dow, and our various collaborators that have injected lots of fun and interesting work into what we do. One of them is sitting right here. Anthony Rogers participated in some of the economic analysis for the first pilot site. And with that, I'll say thanks. And stay tuned for more. We'll be submitting papers for peer review in the next few months. We have our annual report up on our site where you can read more in detail.
Definitely ask questions, but for our folks who are participating electronically, we need to ask the questions into the mic, or Sheila needs to repeat them so that they can actually hear us. So would love to open up the floor and see if anybody has anything they want to ask.
Sheila, great stuff. It's really good to be to see these ideas being put into practice, and great that Anthony was able to participate in the hedonic analysis of the water work, and that Daniela will be part of the work in Brazil. I wonder if you could say a bit more about the work in Brazil and what sort of ecosystem services you think that the sugarcane plantation managers might be overlooking. And I ask about this not because I know anything about sugarcane, I don't, but I know something about the plantation industries in Southeast Asia, the rubber and oil palm plantations. And you know, those folks are really very knowledgeable about soil and water, as you mentioned. I mean, it's really their business, and there's, you know, huge investment at stake. And you know, if you go back to the 1920s, 1930s, and read some of the reports of those companies at that point, they're talking a lot about soil erosion risks and how to manage to prevent those, and you know, move ahead to the 60s, 70s. Lots of research on, you know, they're looking at how best to manage the land. And so it seems to me they've got a deep interest in figuring out the ecosystem services that benefit them directly. And I'm wondering what they might be overlooking. It seems to me it must be you know, really new results that are in the science that they don't know about, because some of the basic issues of management of water and soil on their property, they do have the strong incentive to look carefully at those and take them into account when they make their decisions. So if you could just speculate, what might they be overlooking in the case of Brazil that could benefit them?
Sure. Well, first to start, I mean, what you said is totally right in the sense that these people are very aware of the importance of soil quality and water to what they do. You know, that's part of what made that second pilot coming to like a shared question so much easier, because these were things that they were already worried about. But what they hadn't really been able to do was to connect what they wanted to how they were meeting the compliance with the Brazil Forest Code. So they weren't actually thinking as much about how they could be reforesting areas to prevent soil erosion. So they were thinking about soil erosion, but they were tending to use more traditional techniques for how they till the soil, or picking plots that have particular, you know, elevation gradients on them. And so it was really, it's been a lot more about marrying the two objectives of complying with the forest code and optimizing where they plant the sugarcane. But to get more specific on the actual ecosystem services, we've been really focused on, again, soil erosion and water quality. Those are two big ones. But then also thinking a little bit more about some of the services that benefit the surrounding community who are also employees. But because I've been a little less close to that work, I don't know how much more the actual services have been the aha, or like how to get them through planning of reforestation.
I guess it seems to me that trust is a key issue in terms of these ecosystem services, and really you need to build that trust on the company's behalf, that they're going to get out what they put in for these ecosystem services. And you mentioned it a little bit in when you were talking about the water at the Dow chemical facility. You said that the cost for it's cost competitive solutions, but there's more risks.
Yep.
So I was wondering, I guess, how much further you need to go in quantifying and sort of making the companies comfortable with the risk before you'll start to see widespread adoption, and whether that might be through more academic studies or whether it might be through getting, like you said, the EPA on board and policy decisions, and sort of where you see that going in the near and long term.
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two aspects there. You know, we talk about how do they account for risk all the time, you know, and you know, what's interesting is, you know, accounting on one hand can be very traditional, but there's other aspects of it that have judgment involved, right? And so they decide, obviously it's based on some accounting initially, but they decide how much risk they are going to be comfortable with. And so that's a bit more of a value decision or a leadership decision on their end, but getting to a point where a particular strategy or option fits into that range, I think the more that we can show data on these things is simply the answer. I mean, there's some unknowns, like there's always going to be unknowns, but I think the work that we did pretty much took a lot of these things from being like not even on the table to on the table. And it tends to be with solutions like the freshwater ones that there's sort of this iterative exploration. So if they make a particular cut, first a qualitative one. We run through a bunch of metrics. We say, is this timely? Does it even have a chance of being cost effective? Is the volume probably, reasonable to go after? That's how we got to that set of 5. Then we did a cost benefit analysis that showed what was attractive. And really, then to go forward with any of those other ones, there would actually be more detailed analysis before an investment happens. So capital allocation decisions have a different level of rigor than just like changing expenses. And so if it's something that involves capital allocation, there's going to be much more detailed analysis, and that's where you're going to get to the point where you need to sort of show you're comfortable with the risk, or that you can quantify it to some extent.
This is really interesting and I think critical going forward. I love to see this work happening and you're making good progress. I wonder how well it would translate, especially the methods you guys are developing, to small and medium-sized businesses. Do you need a certain scale to make some of these investments worthwhile? Particularly when you're thinking about pushing this down the supply chain, these companies, the bigger companies may be worthwhile for them to invest in this and coordinate this, but the smaller companies in their supply chains, maybe not. That's something to think about.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of what we've been doing, arguably is just not going to be the methods that would be the methods even themselves would be cost effective for a smaller business that has less technical expertise. And so some of what we're thinking about is, how do we demonstrate this as a model sort of for businesses with different capacities? And, some of it might be sufficient that sort of guidelines or the sensitivity analyses that come out of this can be enough for certain businesses to say, that's something that's starting to make sense for us. We don't need the Cadillac version analysis to go forward. So that's more on the side of, do they have the capacity to do all these things? But then there's just, I think the other part of your question is kind of getting at, these still are public goods, and if they make an investment in a public good, are they really getting enough of a benefit out of it? And so I think, like the freshwater examples, and even the coastal one is a good one where, businesses might identify that they get some benefit, but identifying that there are these other benefits, like the public benefits, it's really a key step in figuring out where the business could be a leader in the investment, but it really will only make sense or will feel safer if it's a multi-stakeholder sort of activity. And I think this is positioning businesses to be leaders for investments in public goods, and that they can mobilize governments or other businesses for that matter. And some small businesses won't be the leaders, but they could join into these sort of multi-stakeholder endeavors. And I forgot to mention it, but there's a proposal going forward for the Lone Star National Recreation Area through this zone. So that's something that Dow, even though the private protection of coastal habitats is not so huge, those other big benefits and the fact that there's this collaborative effort going forward in terms of zoning the coastal area on the kind of the hedge of ooh, wow, sea level rise and storms. But by the way, we also have this biodiversity and recreation. It makes it start to make more sense for them to support something like that. I think we've got a question at the Marine Lab. Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear it? Okay. I have a question that is really interesting, but one of the things I didn't hear or see in your list of collaborators, and maybe it went on and you just didn't talk about it particularly, and I think it's true in the States, but even more so as you look abroad, there was no sort of talk about surrounding communities, how they were involved, how it might affect them. Obviously, air pollution is an obvious one where you think, okay, so maybe net the forest is absorbing the ozone, but what are the local effects and how is it affecting people nearby? So how did you sort of try to involve local communities, and how can they be brought in better, especially in international situations?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there's two ways. One, initially, what I mentioned earlier, the sort of accounting stance that we've taken is measuring benefits to the business, to the public, both local to global, and then biodiversity benefits. So we've been exploring how any of these decisions or solutions do affect the community. However, in the actual analysis and development of the projects, there has not been really so much involvement of the community. And although that sounds like something we would really like and is actually something, now that some of these solutions look attractive, going forward or actually even now, there is more community engagement. For confidentiality reasons, with some of the data we're dealing with in particular aspects of the business decisions, we're not engaging the community in these sort of analyses. I mean, on one hand, sort of for us, TNC Texas has represented a lot of local interest and helped us keep that perspective, while obviously they're part of TNC and can keep the confidentiality agreement. But now, for instance, with the large-scale reforestation for urban air pollution, we've been having conversations with the mayor of Houston. That's been in the Houston Chronicle. There's now a lot more engagement of the public there because the public benefits from that are quite big in terms of, we quantified, health, potential health impacts, recreational benefits, amenity values to homes. And also there's just a need right now because of a loss of a lot of urban forests around Houston. So for various reasons around the confidentiality of some of the aspects of the analyses, the public engagement has happened more later.
Right. I mean, just as a follow-up to that, I mean, obviously I'm coming from a certain position, but what worries me is having the big organizations and the corporations assessing what the public good is, as opposed to talking to the public. I'm sure you've heard that before. It's a common criticism.
Yep, definitely.
And it seems like maybe you need more capacity to actually go, even if you're not sharing confidential information, to be interviewing local people. What are your concerns? How does this affect you?
So to clarify, it actually is a bit different in Brazil. There was some outreach in Texas initially, both by our folks and the Dow folks, about what we're doing and how this might relate. So there was awareness. But with Brazil, the mayor of that town actually was at our initial planning meeting, our initial kickoff. And so they've been more engaged up front in terms of talking about what sort of benefits or impacts that they expect from the facility as well as the forest. And in the case of Brazil, the mayor was particularly interested and concerned about drinking water quality, and so saw some of the analyses that we were doing as well aligned with his interests. So there we were more engaged straight away.
So I'm interested in the prioritization issues, and do you see this as part of this work as part of a greater strategy where there are certain circumstances where there's an overlap between what's in companies' best interests and the provision of public goods, and those are places to do this kind of work. And then there are other places where there's like very little overlap, and those are places we need to just sink money and buy land or do other things. Is that part of what's motivating all this, and is that the trick, like identifying that overlap, or am I looking at this totally wrong?
No, I think that's a really good question, and it's I hinted a little bit early on in the talk about sort of how this has intersected with the conversation and debate at TNC about what does this mean about our priorities and where we're working. Is this, forwarding our mission, or is by working on this, are we not working on other things that are more important, right? Sort of obvious stuff. And okay, so I think you're asking, do we work in places where there's going to be obvious benefits for nature and businesses, and then other places we just say we got to do straight out investments? I'd love to say that we're being really strategic about that. I mean, I think that we're thinking about it that way, but it hasn't gotten into the formal sort of prioritization in terms of coming down to the ground. We do actually very sophisticated prioritization schemes around, as I was showing earlier, identifying key ecoregions where we're working, and working with businesses now is fitting more of this other model where you're saying, okay, we're finding places where we think there might be opportunities where businesses are going to invest in nature, but we're finding that it might take us outside of the places we, based on our ecological analysis alone, identified as important. But that's raised the question of whether that's really how we should be prioritizing. Should we be prioritizing just based on the traditional ecological targets, or do we prioritize biodiversity and ecosystem services? Is it an and, or is it or? How do we balance between the two? And that's actually that's an evolving issue within the Conservancy. So we're definitely thinking a lot about it, and there are people thinking, how do we solve that problem, and how should we really specify that objective? But I wouldn't say we're there yet in terms of having our formal conservation planning, which we have a very formal process for, incorporating that quite yet.
I want to geek out a little bit on the coastal protection portion. I don't know if there's anyone else in here that's just done a lot of
this is methods light, so ask away.
I guess a basic question is, did you do, relative sea level rise modeling that went into that? So you talked about the INVEST tool.
Yep.
You talked about storm surge and sea level rise.
Right.
So I did a project in Louisiana, and you talked a little bit about that, but that area is specifically, areas are sinking really fast.
Right.
In other areas, I guess the problems are sometimes more about the dynamics of the whole system. I mean, a wall, if you put up a wall, the problem is that sea level rises and other things happen. Those wetlands disappear, and you lose those benefits. And even if it's not benefiting the company, like you said, there's value for the community and other people. So I'm wondering if kind of the whole landscape was taken into account. And
yeah. So I'm only showing you just little bits of the key results, but what we actually started with coastal protection is, we identified the decision. Okay, is it you build levees, or you maintain the habitat, or even restore the habitat? So that's the decision. But then there's all these other things going on in the background, right, that we have to project forward to evaluate those decisions in the future. And so the two big drivers that we were concerned with were sea level rise and coastal development. And so we actually modeled the habitat, not just in that little square in front of the Stratton Ridge facility, but actually the entire Brazoria County, so the county that they sit in, the coastal zone there. So we took global projections for sea level rise and local data on subsidence and other factors, and had a local projection of sea level rise, actually 5 different scenarios of sea level rise. The results I showed you were for a most likely scenario of about 1 meter, a little more actually, by 2100. And we use the sea level rise affecting marshes model. So this has been widely used, developed initially
That's what we use.
at the EPA. Okay, so that's what we use. And that accounts for a lot of key marsh processes like accretion and the interaction between rising sea levels and salinity and growth rates and things like that. So I'd say in that sense it was a fairly sophisticated modeling of the habitat. But of course, there's certain aspects that I still felt were pretty limiting. Like I think there's still not a great understanding of how well marshes will keep up with sea level rise. So the function.
That was actually going to be my follow-up. So if you got them, one of the key takeaways to that is that they realize the value of those marshes, maybe to the public, recreation, other values.
Yeah.
Is it something where eventually? I mean, at the end of the day, you build up area. They're going to protect the facility no matter what, and the value is there. They're not going anywhere. You said it's the biggest one, one of the biggest ones in the world, and one of the biggest ones for them. So, seeing that value, are they now interested in, like, I guess, doing some things to maintain those wetlands, even though it's not actually, like you said, 4 kilometers of wetlands isn't going to do.
Yeah.
To protect the
so I think this main message that the existing marshes aren't providing a lot of additional benefit was key, but then probably even more important was what you're getting at is that the results that I didn't show with sea level rise, what they will lose. So those results did account for sea level rise going forward, but then other more extreme scenarios show that their additional levy costs would be quite high, and the property, not high, but a percentage increase to start paying attention to, let's say. And the property damages will be higher as well. So I think that for them was like, they hadn't been thinking about sea level rise, which is interesting. And then the notion that living coastlines do have the potential to actively keep up with sea level rise was a potential learning. Although what I was going to say earlier is that I think the science around how well marshes may keep up with sea level rise is still, it's different in every location. The results are pretty across the board, I think.
But do they take do you think they feel a sense of responsibility that, we're here, so this is going to disappear, and like you said, they see the value for other people. So is there any sort of like, well, we should do something about that, even though it really doesn't? I guess it just doesn't affect their bottom line, so that doesn't overlap.
Yeah. So. I can't say that definitively, but after we presented the results, there's a lot of interest in supporting the maintenance of those public benefits, potentially through a relationship with the Lone Star Recreation Area. And some of this also does go strictly to their sustainability goals, which they manage to in a very serious way, because one of them is 100% community approval.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I was hoping you could talk a bit more about how the partnership came about, whether TNC proactively reached out to Dow, or if Dow said, we really want to work with you, we designed a plan together.
Yeah.
And also, maybe what some of the conditions that TNC really wanted to have in place in the partnership. You mentioned publishing research in the peer-reviewed journals.
Right.
Is that something that you said this is absolutely necessary? Or did Dow say, we want this research to be known more widely so that, we can have that leadership space?
Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks for asking that. I wanted to tell that story earlier, but didn't get to really fit it in. So I think it's an interesting story because Dow is headquartered in Midland, Michigan, and they had a philanthropic relationship with TNC via Michigan for a long time. And then I guess sort of one of the next things is that they helped fund, again, philanthropically, one of our water funds, so one of these schemes where you have water users pay upland, usually farmers, to do some conservation activities to try and enhance water availability or water quality in Brazil near one of their sites. So this was kind of an interesting experience for them, opened them up a little bit to the ideas about ecosystem services, but we can't take all the credit. Their CEO pretty much said to their VP of sustainability, who this project is his brainchild in lots of ways, said, okay, what am I missing? we're coming up to our 2015 sustainability goals. We're going to have to think about our next ones. What am I missing? And Neil Hawkins, the VP of Sustainability, had a lot of folks kind of thinking about this, and they didn't really know what it was, but they were like, this ecosystem service thing, it seems important. So they were doing a lot of their own homework. You know, they had actually internal white papers on ecosystem services and different activities that led to them to a point where they had a proposal for us. But coincidentally, we were actually working on a similar proposal at the same time. And so the story goes, because this is right before I joined, that we had a meeting with them, and we had a proposal in our back pocket, and they gave us a proposal, and they looked almost identical. What was probably most remarkable, aside from the realization of the shared, interest around ecosystem services, it was sort of the nature of the collaboration, that it would be long, that it would be focused on science, that it would have a lot of peer-to-peer interaction. So, I spend lots of time on the phone with Dow engineers and risk managers, and I'm sure they're kind of like, didn't think I'd spend so much time with a tree hugger, but hey, we're getting to know each other. So it was really focused on science, and that's what we wanted to, because we wanted to shift away from just doing philanthropic deals to actually producing products and science that could change practices. And then that gets to the other part of your question, which is, well, how do you change practices? We weren't really interested in just changing Dow. So this money came from their foundation, which is important to point out, and we're a nonprofit as well as their foundation is. So all this has to necessarily benefit the public, and so that's why everything's being shared publicly. There's the requirement and goal of peer review of products, and obviously we're using their specific decisions as motivators, and it's like having a laboratory for this stuff. But it's about sharing this with a broader set of businesses and with the conservation community and scientists.
So, Sheila, one of the things that Steve Pulaski and I have been talking about is the need to get a better understanding of the accuracy and precision of estimates of ecosystem services.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly when you look at the regulating services, to use the MA term, our estimates are pretty much all coming from models, right? There's not much that we're able to measure directly. And most of the models are process-based models. And it seems that those, in many cases, haven't been really verified very carefully in settings where you might not have the really high-quality data that was available when those models were developed. And so we don't have, my take on this is we don't have a very good understanding of the performance of these models in situations that are really quite different where they've been developed, which is often in the U.S. So then we'll take a model to Southeast Asia, and you don't have all the data layers that are required. And so I do have this concern that we don't know as much about the performance of these models as we would like. And it seems to me that would be of great concern to companies like Dow if they're going to start changing practices. And I'm wondering to what extent you agree that we need to learn more about how well these models perform, how good these predictions of services are, and how much is Dow and might other companies push us in this direction, which could be a very positive direction, and particularly positive if they're willing to put some money into this and fund some careful studies to do better validation of these models, and maybe as well to compare modeling approaches that are process-based, which seems to be most, the dominant modeling approach used in INVEST, to more statistical approaches and other ways of doing the modeling. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. Prior to this, I definitely would have called myself more of an empiricist. So this is sort of a new place to be working, doing mostly simulation. And I certainly have those same concerns. On one hand, I'd say in some ways this is like a first step in demonstrating the concepts. But in terms of if you're getting to making decisions, you do need to have validation. So, for instance, I'll give you a few examples how that's going forward with this work, but I still think that's a real key thing that we need to identify as this isn't the end. So with the air pollution work, there will actually have to be validation of that as per requirements by the EPA. So that'll be a place where we're going to take that to the next step. With the coastal work, at TNC we're doing actually a good amount of on-the-ground like experiments, but more focused on wave attenuation and than surge. And so we've been having these conversations now with the big catastrophe modelers about how we can leverage their big data sets to validate some of these process-based models. And they also don't use process-based models, so that would be an advancement too. And then with freshwater, that there's been a little bit less of a overall goal about how to validate what we did, other than I talked a little bit about emergency planning, but some of the water availability modeling that we did based on climate change, going forward, Dow is actually going to be monitoring kind of what they're seeing, not just in the river, but in terms of evaporation rates and temperature fit with what we use in our modeling. So we actually do have some ways in which we're going to be trying to validate this going forward, but I think that's really just pretty important because, but it's going to be really costly. At the same time, I think it's not going to be done all the time, and there is a little bit of the perspective that once we have some confidence, we'll be okay going forward with some of these applications. But then there's also the perspective of like, it's okay if it's wrong as long as it's consistent, or relatively giving you a relative, direction. So there's just going to be sort of different requirements sort of based on the needs. So the air pollution one with the EPA requirements is a good example where it's like, yes, that will be validated.
I think we might have time for one more question, if there is one. With that, we'll thank Sheila so much for coming.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.